is Norway, and this is a list of things I wish I had known before taking my motorcycle over there.
This one was completely my fault.
Hi Sprocketeers, my name's Sophie Sprocket, and for those of you who have been following the channel, you'll know that I recently spent a great deal touring Norway. Now, aside from the knowledge that I would break my ribs, there were a few things that I wish I knew before venturing over to the country. Now, in preparation for the trip, I did an absolute ton of research. However, despite this, there was a few things that I wish I had known before starting my trip. So let's jump in. Now, the first few things that I wish I knew was more or less about planning the trip. Now, if you do plan to do a full loop up to Nordkapp just like I did, don't make the same mistake. Don't plan more than 300 kilometers per day. The easiest way to describe Norway is to say that it is definitely the North Coast 500 on steroids, and every time you turn a corner, you get the most amazing views and also just miles and miles of road and hours upon hours of riding. Now, first things first, which is how to get to Norway. Now, there are two main ways of getting into Norway, which is the giant bridge or the ferry. There are benefits to both, but with the bridge you get the fun of physically riding over the ocean on a giant bridge, which is really fun, but it also does add 2 free days to your journey. Alternatively, if you do go with the ferry, it can be just as great of an experience. You get to visit Herschel's, it's a fantastic stop-off point. I personally recommend arriving in Herschel's in the late afternoon, set up base at the campsite on the beach and go and explore the bunkers. It's really fantastic. You can stop overnight, get everything washed, and then jump on the ferry first thing in the morning. You'll arrive in Norway at the same time as if you'd taken the bridge, but you have a nice fun little tourist stopover on the beach, and who doesn't like the beach? Now on to the next thing, which is landmarks. Now in Norway, the most beautiful views are in the southwest of the country, and the further north you travel, the less impressive the views get. By the time you get to Nordkapp, there is more or less just one long, laborious main road, and it's really barren, and you just keep going on this barren road all the way up to Nordkapp. Now, regarding bike touring, you want to waste as much time as possible enjoying the south and seeing those views and seeing those sceneries. And honestly, if you're not that bothered about going to visit Nordkapp, I'd really just recommend staying in the mountain regions and going as far as the Arctic Circle Center, and then more or less doing a U-turn, because all those fantastic windy roads, all of the amazing scenery really is very much in the south of the country. However, if you do want to head to Nordkapp for those tasty bragging rights, we've all been there, it's a thing, I'm not judging, I'm just as bad. But I would suggest crossing the border, traveling up on the Swedish motorway. The speed limits in Sweden are much higher than they are in Norway, and the journey will be no less or more enjoyable than as if you'd gone up through Norway, but it will take significantly less time overall, and you'll still get the bragging rights of visiting Nordkapp. Now, this brings me on to my third point, which is the amount of time to do the trip. I gave myself, I'm really ashamed of this, but I gave myself 3 weeks for the trip. I really regret not giving myself a lot longer time to do it in. If I was going to redo this trip, I would do a minimum of 5 to 6 weeks. And I would spend almost 4 weeks in the south, traveling up to the Arctic Circle and just really enjoying those amazing views. And then from that point, I would have jumped on the Swedish motorway, shot up and down in a week. And then I would have more or less spent the final week just leisurely trolling home. It is doable in 3 weeks. I've shown you that it is completely doable, but oh my God, guys, you cannot begin to imagine how painful it was. So yeah, the ideal time to do this trip, I would definitely say, is 5 to 6 weeks. And the reason being is that you really do want to stop off and enjoy each point of interest and just enjoy the views. Now, I did it in 3 weeks because that is all the annual leave that I had left for the year. And I probably wouldn't do it again in 3 weeks. But like I said, a squished road trip is better than no road trip. So if that's what you've got to work with, that's ultimately what you've got to work with. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is toll roads. Now, Norway has a lot of private toll roads, which are ordinarily really expensive for vehicles. Now, on most toll roads, motorcycles don't actually pay a toll. Huzzah! But there are a few exceptions regarding some really minor private roads and tourist destinations. But you're still much better off on a motorcycle than a car. I didn't know that bikes got toll roads for free, and I ended up making quite a few payments digitally using my phone because I was so worried about fines, and yeah, I'm an idiot and a mug. Now, the other thing to remember about Norwegian roads is that many of the traditional roads aren't really what you'd expect from a road. A lot of the time you'd load up Google Maps and it would send you via a ferry port. This blew my mind so much so. I've always had this idea that ferries were exceptionally expensive, and it's something you do to kind of get from the UK to Europe. But in Norway, it's completely normal to be jumping on 5-6 ferries a day whilst like touring along the main road. And it's completely normal, and it's incredibly affordable as well. You'd be so surprised at how cheap it is. However, what I wish I had known before heading over to Norway was the Ferry Pay app. Now, domestic ferries connect most of the main roads, and more often than not, you do need to pay for the ferries as a biker. However, as I mentioned, they are incredibly cheap and they're incredibly easy to use, especially if you do install the Ferry Pay app. Now, do make sure you set up the Ferry Pay app before you head over. This means you need to install it, you need to add in your registration number, and you need to connect it to a bank account. However, what this allows you to do is that as soon as you pull up to the ferry, you can board instantly as soon as it gets there, and basically you can just dump your bike and run to the toilet. You don't need to mess around with tickets, you don't need to mess around with paying. The ticket man basically walks around the deck, he'll photograph your motorcycle registration plate, and it will add it to your account, and you'll just get charged automatically. Now, I know it's a little bit daunting to basically put in your bank details for an app and then drive onto a ferry without necessarily knowing how much the ferry cost, but to give you a rough estimate, I paid on average about £1.50 a ferry crossing, and I probably saved hundreds on fuel by avoiding all the boring around roads, and sometimes the ferries really are genuinely unavoidable. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is speeding fines and limits. Now, fortunately, this isn't an issue I face because I obey the law. But something worth mentioning for anyone going into Norway is that speeding fines in Norway are brutal, especially around bigger cities. We are talking thousands of pounds. Norway fines you 10% of your annual income if you are caught speeding. To top it off, the speed limits are typically a lot lower in Norway as well, and as a maximum you can expect to be riding between 60 and 70 kilometers per hour. Having said that, most speed cameras in Norway do shoot from the front, so bikers are rarely caught. However, there are a lot of average speed cameras and rear-facing cameras in the cities, and there are always undercover vehicles, and you never quite know where. If you do want to take the road at a higher speed, just cross the border into the neighbouring country. The average speed limit is a lot higher than it is in Norway. Don't risk losing 10% of your income being an idiot. Now, this brings me on to my next point, which is fuel is approximately 20% more expensive in Norway than it is in the neighbouring European countries. Now, having said that, I didn't notice this at all, and the reason I didn't notice was because I was coming from the UK, and when I touched base in France, I was more or less doing a cross-country dash from France to Norway, which meant lots of motorways and lots of motorway petrol station stops. And obviously the price at the motorway stations are a lot higher than it would be on the local, like national routes, which meant that when I did get into Norway and I was taking those local routes and stopping off at local petrol stations, I didn't notice the difference between European motorway service station petrol prices and Norway local prices. I don't know what the prices are like on the motorways in Norway, but to be honest, they don't really have motorways. The next thing that I want to touch on is wild camping, campsites, and huts. Now, as you are probably aware from most of my videos, wild camping is legal in Norway and it's incredibly fun. It is the ultimate country you want to go to if you want to get away from it all. In Norway, camping is allowed almost everywhere as long as you're at least 150 meters from buildings, and you're usually permitted to stay between 2 to 3 days. Now, this wasn't really so much of an issue for me because I moved every single evening as I was working my way up the country. Now, Norway's views as a country when it comes to outdoor activities is that the outdoors are inherently dangerous and it's up to the individual person to use common sense, which is the complete opposite of the UK. Complete opposite. So a lot of the time they don't like ring fence dangerous areas. They're just like, don't be stupid. You know, if you want to go climb that near the edge, expect to fall. In the UK, we'd be like, why isn't there a fence up? But yeah, it's completely different. And so as part of that common sense, it's just a general accepted rule that you shouldn't be a problem for other people and you should always clean up when you leave a site. Now, as someone who likes to camp in forests and fields and beaches, this country is the ultimate playground, but I cannot express enough. Please be a decent person, because otherwise you'll ruin it for the rest of us. Now, I can appreciate that not everybody wants to wild camp in Norway, and in fact there were a few days where the storms were so heavy it did force me into campsites. Now, when it comes to campsites in Norway, they are incredibly affordable, to be honest, but the prices did vary so much. And it's not uncommon for campsites to be unmanned for large amounts of times, either during the day or during the evening. And it's not uncommon to pay remotely via apps like PayPal, or I think one of the campsites, they just sent me a text message with a link. It freaked me out at first. I was really worried about being scammed, but it happened maybe 2-3 times. Most of the time, campsite owners, if the weather is bad, they don't want to come to the campsite and take your cash. So you just text a number when you arrive at reception, they send you a link, you just log in with your GPay, send them the money, and that's it. They'll send you like the code for the toilets and the codes for the showers, and that's pretty much all it is to it. It was definitely a cultural shock. It was just so trusting. And coming from the UK, I found that almost a little bit unnerving at times. Like, they're so certain I'm gonna pay. I mean, I'm gonna pay, but they're so certain I'm gonna pay. Like, there's no suspicion about most people. It was very strange. And it was nice. It was really nice, actually, to be honest. It was nice to visit areas where you weren't presumed to be a criminal. One of the campsites that I stopped at, it literally just had a sign that said, pitch your tent up. There's a little wooden box, just throw a tenner in, job's a good one. And I was just like, what? That would never happen in the UK. Now, when it comes to camping cabins, I noticed, especially in the north, Norwegians usually view tent camping and camping huts almost as the same kind of bracket. Unlike the UK, where you'd expect to pay like over £100 a night for a glamping pod, in Norway they more or less cost the same price as a camping spot. But as you can imagine, they do get booked up first. But having said that, sometimes people would book them and then not show. So it's always worth just kind of asking when you check in. On one of the occasions when I went to check in, someone had booked the entirety of a camping pod for themselves and their friends, and just none of the group showed up, and the campsite owner literally let me have it for an extra €5. It was so good. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is the cost of items as a whole in Norway. Now, contrary to popular belief, Norway, or at least I found that Norway wasn't as expensive as people made it out to be. And sure, it does have a bit more of a pricier cost of living, but if you are really savvy and you do a little bit of planning, you can navigate around the country really easily without breaking the bank. Now, in my second year of university, I spent most of my weekends in Norway relaxing in the countryside, and I remember the prices of food being extortionate in Norway. Now, returning to Norway as an adult was an absolute shell shock, because it was not as expensive as I remember it to be. Over the last few years, living in the UK has become insanely expensive, almost to the point that the Norwegian prices seemed almost normal to me. The only difference was that the cost of takeaways in Norway were still insanely priced. But when it came to like supermarket items, it was just like, oh, okay, this is like 20-40 pence more than what I would pay back home. But it wasn't that crazy. It just tended to be the more unhealthier food that was really expensive. On to my next point. Do not hit a wild deer. Just don't do it. In Norway, wild deer holds special significance for indigenous people who are known as the Sami people, and they have a long-standing cultural, economic tie to these creatures. Now, in Norway, the Sami people are legally recognized as the guardians of the land, and they hold stewardship over all the wild deer in the country. What this means is that all the wild deer legally belong to the indigenous people, and killing one with your vehicle or for whatever reason means that you are effectively stealing and damaging someone else's property, even if it's a wild animal. Now, whilst visiting Norway, I was really lucky to end up in a situation where I had a few conversations with descendants from blended Sami families, and they basically explained to me that hitting a wild deer comes with an extremely hefty price tag due to the strict regulations and also the compensation policies in place to protect both the animals, the motorists, and of course the Sami population. Now, the reason that this compensation scheme exists is because historically the indigenous tribes in Norway were really badly abused by the Norwegian government. It was really bad. Families were ripped apart and the government wanted to educate the savages. It was a really bad time. But what this meant was that it ended up with a lot of activist groups working non-stop to protect the rights of the indigenous people, which means that killing a reindeer would make an activist group make a claim against your insurance. This compensation payout is then placed in this giant financial pot to help subsidize and protect this minority group. Now, beyond the financial implications, colliding with a wild deer can also result in some really serious injuries and even fatalities. It highlights the importance of exercising a lot of caution and awareness when driving through Norway's wilderness. Now, as such, the Norwegian government urges people to respect the tribe's connection to these animals and to drive responsibly to ensure the safety of them and to protect their relationships with the tribe. There's also one more point that I just want to make about the indigenous tribe, which was something that I didn't know until speaking with locals. But something that I learned about the Sami people is that they do not like being referred to as Laplanders. And referring to the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia as Laplanders is considered really outdated and potentially offensive and racist. So try not to use this term. They don't like it. Instead, the referred term by the tribe is to be referred to as the Sami people. The shift in terminology was basically a reflection of their recognition of cultural identity and autonomy and the right to label themselves what they believe. So it's a very historically commonly used term, but try to avoid using it because it's not politically correct. And there you have it. Those are the things that I wish I knew before heading over to Norway with my motorcycle. Now, whether you're a seasoned rider or a novice adventurer, the roads in Norway, they are genuinely just so unforgettable. It's a fantastic experience. It really needs to be on your bucket list. If you've already been to Norway, drop a few comments below. Let me know what your favorite part of the country is, or maybe even places that you wish you'd avoided. I'm really keen to hear your guys' thoughts. For me, it was an experience of a lifetime. It's one of my favorite memories. Even though it didn't have the best of endings, it was such a good trip. I would do it again. Maybe not straight away though. In the meantime, if you do want to see more great content, don't forget to hit subscribe and ride safe, stay crazy. I'll see you next week. My name's Safi Sprocket, signing off.
This one was completely my fault.